Nicaragua. 6 months after the revolution, just how much is there to sing about? The young Nicaraguans of today will never forget the bloody events of 1978 and 1979, when the Sandinista guerrillas led a rebellion that finally toppled the Somoza dynasty. The revolution is now being consolidated. Here in the city of Masaya, traditional seat of opposition to Somoza, children are learning the new vocabulary of post-revolutionary Nicaragua. A series of lectures, singing, poetry reading, and the commemoration of the new martyrs helps children to adjust to the radical upheaval, and the response is enthusiastic. Political education is aimed primarily at the next generation, but the popular forces are still on their guard. The threat of a possible right-wing counter-coup is still taken seriously. The Sandinista National Liberation Front, named after Sandinista, killed in the 1930s on the orders of Somoza's father, organized and led the fight for freedom. The front is now training its own militia, replacing the hated National Guard. This is one of 5 command posts in the capital, Managua. It has a complement of about 70 soldiers, including teenage recruits undergoing basic training. The revolution may have succeeded, but the harsh commands of the officers still have to be obeyed. It's little different from any other military training ground, with strict discipline backed by the power of the state. At this time last year, the Sandinista army was simply a collection of guerrilla bands, armed with an assortment of weapons. Now it's becoming a fighting force determined to hold on to the fruits of victory. Organizing the militia is one of the tasks of the Neighborhood Defense Committees, the CDS. They also help in political education, distributing food and medical supplies, and organizing cultural and sporting events. But 6 months ago, it was different. During the Civil War, they helped to coordinate resistance against the old National Guard, for example, ripping up paving blocks to build crude barricades in the streets of Managua. This was one way to protect the poor districts, the barrios, against the mobile and well-equipped National Guardsmen. Ironically, the rebels were often fighting against guardsmen from equally poor backgrounds, but good pay and harsh discipline, plus the fear of reprisals if the war were lost, made the Guard fiercely loyal to Somoza. It all made for a brutal and bloody civil war. This was part of the drive against the city of Leon after its takeover by the Sandinista forces. The toll was heavy among guerrillas and innocent civilians too. The horrors of civil war were repeated in towns and cities across the country, but still General Anastasio Somoza clung to power. General Somoza constantly took a hard line. He crushed the rebels in their first push in 1978, and he was determined they would be defeated again. Other countries giving help to the rebels, he named Costa Rica, Panama, and Venezuela, were attacking what he termed the good reputation of Nicaragua as a peaceful and democratic country. Law and order must be maintained. The constitutional rights of all citizens were being respected, insisted the general. As far as Somoza was concerned, his enemies were Nicaragua's enemies, and he would never leave.
Lo considero yo un acto criminal.
The excesses of the National Guard only strengthened the opposition to Somoza, and there was a steady flow of new recruits to the Sandinista front. Barricades sprang up in almost every town, and frequently the young rebels succeeded in defeating the local National Guard garrison. Many had seen friends and relatives killed or imprisoned by the Somoza forces in the 1978 fighting. And when the rebellion was relaunched in 1979, the Sandinista resolve was firm and morale high. Somoza, for his part, seemed determined to fight to the finish with everything he had. His air force was far from sophisticated by modern standards, but with no anti-aircraft fire to deter them, his planes were able to give support to the National Guard forces on the ground, now hard-pressed by the guerrillas. The aircraft also dropped bombs, many of them incendiaries, on rebel strongholds like Esteli. And actions like this indicated Somoza was prepared to see the country ruined rather than give up power. Meanwhile, the morale of the National Guard was slumping, and the rebellion was so widespread that Somoza's forces were stretched to breaking point. By June, Somoza was ordering block-by-block street fighting from his fortified bunker in Managua. By this time, the United States had lost all interest in propping up an unwanted regime. As the flood of refugees continued, it was in fact pressure from Washington and from other Latin American states that finally forced Somoza to resign on July the 17th, 1979. And so Nicaragua set about the task of repairing the damage. Somoza was gone, and he left the country virtually bankrupt. He took with him the family's massive fortune, the result of controlling all major sources of revenue in the country. He and his supporters also looted the central bank before leaving. So Nicaragua found itself with 50,000 dead, 150,000 injured, 500,000 or more homeless, massive foreign debts. But the people showed their readiness to start the rebuilding from the lowest level, relaying the same paving stones that the rebels had torn up to make barriers against the National Guard. There are no plans for any national elections in the immediate future, because there's general agreement that the country must first be put back on its feet. The new leadership is aptly called the Government of National Reconstruction. The revolutionary junta that assumed power was initially something of a mystery. It is basically left-wing, dominated by the Sandinista National Liberation Front. But it does include centrist and conservative groups. The front has always realized that anything more radical would frighten off the American and Western aid it so badly needs.
Que ha sido designado por la Junta de Gobierno de Reconstrucción Nacional, que es el compañero.
Economists, lawyers, and even rich industrialists have taken positions in government, and United States and Western bankers, Nicaragua's main hope for raising the massive cash loans it needs, are being assured that the new leadership is far from committed to a Cuban-style revolution. In fact, it's claimed that 75% of the Nicaraguan economy is still in private hands and will remain there. Sandinista spokesmen say they have been criticized on two sides, by some for being revolutionary Marxists, and by others for selling out the revolution to the capitalists. They insist neither is true. They want a pluralistic society and a mixed economy. The main goal is the reconstruction of Nicaragua. Some political infighting is sure to lie ahead, but in the meantime, there is general agreement that a liberal but broad-based regime is in the country's best interests. One of the junta's pledges was that there would be no indiscriminate reprisals against the old National Guard. But thousands of former guardsmen and Somoza sympathizers are being held in prisons, like at the Modelo prison in Tipitapa, northwest of Managua. Visiting relatives are allowed to bring food and clothing for the prisoners, but officials are reluctant to give too many privileges to visitors for fear of relatives taking the opportunity to re-establish an underground network against the revolution. There has been no large-scale avenging of old scores in spite of the past brutality of the National Guard, although some recent murders have been attributed to political motives. Instead, a judicial process had already started to bring some 7,800 former Somoza supporters before special tribunals. Chief Prosecutor Senora Nora Astorga, heroine of the revolution, has urged Nicaraguans to come forward with evidence against the prisoners who face charges ranging from corruption to murder. The Sandinistas outlawed the death penalty after the overthrow of Somoza, and the maximum penalty under the new regime is 30 years imprisonment.
Por favor, hombre, esta gente, hágase para allá.
The acts of the new leadership, in the words of the first Interior Minister, Thomas Borga, should reflect a generous revolution. The emphasis must be on reconciliation and reconstruction, and there is a lot to rebuild. Factories were bombed and shelled, as well as homes, schools and hospitals. Businesses were looted, and the whole economic infrastructure was severely damaged. 30% of the country's industry is said to have been destroyed. Previously, the Somoza family, which had been in power since 1936, directly controlled large areas of the economy. Since last July, most of the Somoza properties have been nationalized, together with the banks, insurance companies, the mines, and much foreign trade. The city of Esteli, before the Civil War, was a prosperous and progressive city of about 45,000 people. But after successive waves of bloody fighting, the population shrank to 10,000 before Somoza finally conceded defeat. It has since risen again, like the population of the country as a whole, as refugees return to their homes. Many inhabitants of Esteli returned to a sad sight, their homes shattered or destroyed. In all, some 80 city blocks were destroyed in the war. The rebuilding provides work for some of the thousands of unemployed in the country. With the disruption of business and industry, the unemployment rate shot up to 50% immediately after the war, and in some urban areas, the level was as high as 60%. There's also the public services to restore, such as water, electricity, and transport, but new homes are one of the main priorities. Another major problem in the post-revolutionary period was health and medicine. Thousands had suffered war injuries. Others were enduring illness and malnutrition without proper treatment. Even Red Cross centers had been attacked by the National Guard. There has been a flood of patients here in Esteli to a Spanish military hospital renamed after a Spanish priest who died in the fighting. Spain, with the United States, has been one of the principal sources of humanitarian aid. One of the aims of health workers has been to ensure that everyone in Nicaragua is vaccinated against cholera, the killer disease that often appears in the wake of destruction. This battle has been a successful one. There has been no major outbreak of disease, and health services have improved enormously. Doctors and nurses have returned to their jobs, abandoned at the height of the war. The Red Cross can do its work without being harassed, and supplies and equipment from abroad have been distributed without delay. Masaya, known as the City of Flowers, a title that was mocked by the destruction of the war. It lies quite near Managua and felt the full weight of the Somoza forces. The unpaved streets reflect the neglect of the Somoza years. But things are now on the move, especially in the schools. Teachers have changed their approach substantially in recent months. At elementary school, children hear and read simple stories of the heroes of the revolution, in addition to the basics of education. And even at this age, the pupils know what the stories are about. They are from Monimbo, the poorest area of Masaya, and the first district of the city to start the insurrection of 1978. The price was high. According to the mayor, up to 300 Masaya school children were killed during the war. Posters commemorate revolutionary heroes. The school itself is named after a Monimbo teacher killed by the National Guard. The revolution is also making its mark on the theatre. This is a visiting Cuban theatre group, touring the country to put across the message of the revolution. The main themes are the human pitfalls of post-revolution, namely laziness, lack of punctuality, disorganization, and the lack of political consciousness.
La pobre, el susto que se daría.
Ah, lo mucho que sufriría.
Tan linda la pobrecita.
Bueno,
No le oculta la mascota al trabajo creador.
Un momento, caballero, son las 2, ya no voy más.
no es la verdad que no, son las 11 nada más.
Voy a decirle a Tomás que nació el hijo de abuelo.
Se lo dirán en enero.
Bueno, luego a Pedro, que en febrero voy a coger vacaciones.
Voy a tener razones.
A darle a Antonio razones de la mujer de Agapito.
A trabajar un poquito.
It's a comedy, but with a serious message, a form of theatre that's much practiced in Cuba. Transplant to Nicaragua is clearly a success.
¿Y qué usted cree? Gracias a mi tractor volando el domingo estoy en la moza de mi corazón.
¿Y a mi madre quién le dice que al baile yo quiero ir?
El mismo que está mirando. A la carreta y a la familia completa la llevo hasta el fin del mundo.
Ay, pero mira que tú eres bueno.
Ah, buenísimo, buenísimo.
Bueno, para servirla y cuidarla.
Y así.
Regresa en victoria, cambiarás en un momento.
Un bache.
¡Viva la revolución!
¡Viva!
¡Viva la central sandinista de trabajadores!
¡Viva!
¡Viva los estudiantes nicaragüenses!
¡Viva!
¡Viva Nicaragua!
¡Viva!
There has also been a more active Cuban presence in Nicaragua. Medical aid, advisors, and even an alleged direct role in the Civil War. The Cuban issue is of concern to some of Nicaragua's neighbors, especially Honduras, with which it shares a long border. Honduras has a military government and was formerly a close ally of General Somoza. It supplied him with arms during the war when his supplies were running low, and now relations are far from friendly. About 3,000 members of the old National Guard have been given refuge across the border. Honduras has also refused to hand back 30 boats and 7 planes used by fleeing Somozistas. There was a series of border clashes towards the end of 1979, and although a form of peaceful coexistence was established, there remains a degree of mistrust and fear on both sides. Nicaragua is still nervous about a possible counter-coup being launched from Honduras by the die-hard remnants of the National Guard. On the other side, the right-wing elements in the Honduras military junta are worried that the popular revolution next door might be contagious, and that they might suffer the same fate as Somoza, now in exile in Paraguay. But the problems of relations with neighboring countries are dwarfed by Nicaragua's economic difficulties. Shortages of food and the loss of export cash crops are causing deep concern. The 1979 cotton crop, for example, was totally lost, depriving the country of $150 million in export earnings. Beneath the smoking volcano Cristobal, sugarcane is cut. The sugar harvest, fortunately, is from November to May, and so escaped much of the war damage. The major problem during the war, however, was the disruption to the movements of migrant workers who traditionally have handled each of the major crops in turn. At the height of the fighting, packaged sugar from the previous harvest was stolen, costing the country another $7 million in lost export earnings, a lot in its present dire straits. This refinery at Chichigalpa is Central America's largest. It was damaged, but it's now back in full production. Local economists say that there are healthier prospects for both the sugar and coffee harvests, which survived undamaged. But this will have little impact on Nicaragua's severe balance of payments difficulties, especially as a large import of grains is underway to meet basic food needs. This rice, for example, it comes from Spain and is being repackaged into consumer-sized bags weighing 2.5 kilograms each. Because of the urgent need, the packaging operation goes on around the clock, operated by 3 shifts of workers. Nicaragua has also received generous food aid from the United States. This has taken 3 forms: direct deliveries, contributions through the World Food Programme, and concessional wheat sales. One more long-range concern is a new plan for use of the land. The government acted quickly to nationalize holdings of the Somoza family, said to total 60% of all arable land. This, as well as uncultivated land of absentee landlords, will remain state property for the time being. The new regime has deliberately delayed parceling out land to the people because of the critical state of food production and the need to reorganize the agricultural sector. For the time being, the land will be worked by landless peasants and migrant workers organized in cooperatives. Apart from everything else, Nicaragua needs breathing space on repaying the debts left by the Somoza regime, estimated at $1.5 billion. A moratorium on these repayments is now being negotiated with international monetary organizations. The country also needs fresh loans. Belatedly, these are now trickling in. The United States has offered a welcome $75 million, but only if there are no Soviet or Cuban troops in the country. There is, in fact, no shortage of Cubans in Nicaragua now. These street minstrels singing revolutionary songs, for example. Cuban minstrels, of course, don't pose a threat to anyone. But there are said to be 1,200 Cuban technicians and teachers inside the country now. Even Central American states like Costa Rica and Panama, which played their part in helping the rebels to get rid of General Somoza, have showed signs of discomfort with the pace of the Sandinista revolution. Recently, the Interior Minister, Thomas Borga, described as pro-Cuban, visited both countries to reassure them that the Sandinistas had no intention of exporting their revolution. Still, mistrust of anything Cuban persists in many quarters. There have been rumors of Cuban troops providing support for the new Nicaraguan army deployed along the Honduras border, the most likely origin of any counter-revolutionary offensive. Ridding the country of the stifling effects of Somoza rule is a huge task for the new government, and it's the culmination of a harsh decade. In 1972, Managua and other parts of the country were devastated by an earthquake, and there are still reminders of it. Massive international aid poured in then for victims of the quake, but Somoza was accused of diverting most of it into his own companies. The former government fort at Masaya, now known as Coyotepe Prison, houses a number of former Somoza supporters awaiting trial. It typifies the relatively relaxed way Nicaragua has coped with revolution. Once a week, a priest celebrates Mass in the camp. He also brings food to supplement the Spartan prison diet shared by prisoners and guards alike. It takes the appearance of an armed guard to provide a reminder that this is still a prison. The church remains a vital influence in Nicaraguan life. Its leaders are respected by the people and Sandinists alike for their strong anti-Somoza stand during the Civil War. The church, in fact, is seen as providing a healthy balance to the left-wing tendencies of the present government in the months ahead. Faced with so many difficulties, the Sandinist-led junta can ill afford to alienate any section of the population. It needs the goodwill of all if the Civil War victory is not to degenerate into chaos. So far, despite some early reservations abroad, the Sandinistas have won high marks for their handling of their generous revolution.